The towhees are good at keeping a secret. While watching for them, I heard a noise that suggested angry cats spitting at each other, and 3 jackrabbits came racing down the chaparral-covered knoll. One of them shot off at a tangent, while the other 2 trotted along the openings in the brush as if their trails were roads in a park. Then a cottontail rabbit came out on a spot of hard yellow earth encircled by bushes, and lying down on its side, kicked up its heels and rolled like a horse, after which the pretty thing stretched itself full length on the ground to rest, showing a pink light in its ears. After a while it got up, scratched one ear, and with a kick of one little furry leg, ran off in the brush. Another day when I sat waiting, I saw a jackrabbit's ears coming through the brush. He trotted up within a few feet, when he stopped, facing me with head and ears up, a noble-looking little animal, reminding me of a deer with antlers branching back. He stood looking at me, not knowing whether to be afraid or not, and turning one ear trumpet and then the other. But though smiling at him, I was a human being, there was no getting around that, and after a few undecided hops this way and that, he ran off and disappeared in the brush. Near where he had been was a spot where a number of rabbit runways came to a center, and around it the rabbit council had been sitting in a circle, their footprints proved. Brown chippies were not much commoner around the ranch house than western house wrens were, but the big prosaic brown birds seemed much more commonplace. The wrens were strongly individual and winning wherever they were met. They nested in all sorts of odd nooks and corners about the buildings. One went so far as to take up its abode in the wire-screened refrigerator that stood outside the kitchen under an oak. Another pair stowed their nest away in an old nose-bag hanging on a peg in the wine-shed, while a third lived in one of the old grape crates piled up in the raisin-shed. The crate nest was delightful to watch. The jolly little birds, with tails over their backs and wings hanging, would sing and work close beside me, only 3 or 4 feet away. They would look up at me with their frank, fearless eyes, and then squeeze down through their crack into the crate, and sit and scold inside it. Such an amusing, muffled little scold. The nest was so astonishingly large I was interested to measure it. Twigs were strewn loosely over one end of the box, covering a square nearly 16 inches on a side. The compact high body of the nest measured 8 by 10 inches, and came so near the top of the crate that the birds could just creep in under the slats. Some of the twigs were 10 inches long, regular broom handles, in the bills of the short bobbing wrens. One of the birds once appeared with a twig as long as itself. It flew to the side of a beam with it, at sight of me, and stood there balancing the stick in its bill in pretty fashion. Another time it flew to the peak of the shed to examine an old swallow's nest now occupied by linnets, and amused itself throwing down its neighbor's straws, the naughty little rogue! Such jolly songsters! They were fairly bubbling over with happiness all the time. They had an old stub in front of the shed that might well have been called the singing stub, for they kept it ringing with music when they were not running on inside the shed. They seemed to warble as easily as most birds breathe. In fact, song seemed a necessity to them. There was a high pole in front of the shed, and one day I found my ebullient little friend squatting on top to hold himself on while he sang out at the top of his lungs. Another time I came face to face with a pair when the songster was in the midst of his roundelay. He stopped short, bobbed nervously from side to side, and then, rising to his feet and putting his right foot forward with a pretty courageous gesture, took up his song again. When the pair were building in the crate, I stuck some white hen's feathers there, thinking they might like to use them. Mr. Troglodytes came first, and seeing them, instead of turning tail as I have known brave guardians of the nest to do, burst out singing, as if it were a huge joke. Then he hopped down to the rim of the box to scrutinize the plumes, after which he flew out. But he had to stop to sing a tilt of an elder stem before he could go to tell his spouse about them. One day, when riding back to the ranch, I saw 6 turkey buzzards soaring over the meadow. Perhaps there was a dead jackrabbit in the field. It was astonishing to see how soon the birds would discover small carrion from their great height. The ranchmen never thought of burying anything. They were such good scavengers. A few hours after an animal was thrown out in the field, the vultures would find it. They would stand on the body and pull it to pieces in a most revolting way. The ranchman told me he had seen them circle over a pair of fighting snakes, waiting to devour the one that was injured. They were grotesque birds. I often saw them walk with their wings held out at their sides, as if cooling themselves, and the unbirdlike attitude, together with the horrid appearance of their red skinny heads, made them seem more like harpies than before. They were most interesting at a distance. I once saw 3 of them standing like black images on a granite boulder, on top of a hill overlooking the valley. After a moment they set out and went circling in the sky. Although they flew in a group, it seemed as if the individual birds respected one another's lines so as not to cover the same ground. Sometimes when soaring, they seemed to rest on the air and let themselves be borne by the wind, for they wobbled from one side to the other like a cork on rough water. One of the most interesting birds of the valley is the roadrunner or chaparral cock, a grayish-brown bird who stands almost as high as a crow and has a tail as long as a magpie's. He is noted for his swiftness of foot. Sometimes, when we were driving over the hills, a roadrunner would start out of the brush on a lonely part of the road and for quite a distance keep ahead of the horses, although they trotted freely along. When tired of running, he would dash off into the brush, where he stopped himself by suddenly throwing his long tail over his back. A Texan, in talking of the bird, said, "It takes a right pert cur to catch one," and added that when a roadrunner is chased he will rise but once, for his main reliance is in his running, and he does not trust much to his short wings. The chaparral cocks nested in the cactus on our hills, and were said to live largely on lizards and horned toads. It became evident that a pair of these singular birds had taken up quarters in the chaparral on the hillside back of the ranch house, for one of them was often seen with the hens in the dooryard. One day I was talking to the ranchman when the roadrunner appeared. He paid no attention to us, but went straight to the hen house, apparently to get cocoons. Looking between the laths, I could see him at work. He flew up on the hen roost as if quite at home. He had been there before and knew the ways of the house. He even dashed into the peak of the roof and brought down the white cocoon balls dangling with cobweb. When he had finished his hunt, he stood in the doorway, and a pair of blackbirds lit on the fence post over his head, looking down at him wonderingly. Was he a new kind of hen? He was almost as big as a bantam. They sat and looked at him, and he stood and stared at them, till all 3 were satisfied, when the blackbirds flew off, and the roadrunner walked out by the kitchen to hunt among the buckets for food. These curious birds seem to be of an inquiring turn of mind, and sometimes their investigations end sadly. The windmills, which are a new thing in this dry land, naturally stimulate their curiosity. A small boy from the neighboring town, Escondido, told me that he had known 4 roadrunners to get drowned in one tank, though he corrected himself afterwards by saying, "We fished out one before he got drowned." Another lad told me he had seen roadrunners in the nesting season call for their mates on the hills. He had seen one stand on a boulder 15 feet high, and after strutting up and down the rock with his tail and wings hanging, stop to call, putting his bill down on the rock and going through contortions as if pumping out the sound. The lad thought his calls were answered from the brush below. In April, the ranchman reported that he had seen dusky poor-wills, relatives of our whippoorwills, out fly-catching on the road beyond the ranch house after dark. He had seen as many as 8 or 9 at once, and they had let him come within 3 feet of them. Accordingly, one night right after tea, I started out to see them. The poor-wills choose the most beautiful part of the 24 hours for their activity. When I went out, the sky above the dark wall of the valley was a quiet greenish yellow, and the rosy light was fading in the north at the head of the canyon. White masses of fog pushed in from the ocean. Then the constellations dawned and brightened till the evening star shone out in her full radiant beauty. Locusts and crickets droned, bats zigzagged overhead, and suddenly from the dusty road some black objects started up, fluttered low over the barley, and dropped back on the road again. At the same time came the call of the poor-will, which close at hand is a soft burring "Poor-will, poor-willow." 2 or 3 hours later I went out again. The full moon had risen and shone down, transforming the landscape. The road was a narrow line between silvered fields of headed grain, and the granite boulders gleamed white on the hills enclosing the sleeping valley. For a few moments the shrill barking of coyote wolves disturbed the stillness. Then again the night became silent. Peace rested upon the valley, and from far up the canyon came the faint, sad cry, "Poor willow, poor willow." End of Chapter 7.